On the 25th of September, 1396, on the banks of the Danube, in the heart of Bulgaria, a battle took place that forever changed the course of European history. On this day, the finest knights of the Christian world, Hungarians, French, Burgundians, English, and Germans, faced the war machine of the rising Ottoman Empire. The outcome of this clash was not merely the result of one battle. It was the last great medieval crusade, which ended an era and showed that the old knightly world was no longer capable of stopping the Ottoman conquest that embodied new, modern warfare. This is a story about how an expedition thirsting for glory turned into tragedy, how the pride of medieval knighthood dragged Europe's finest warriors into destruction, and how on that September day began the Ottoman threat that kept the continent in fear for centuries. The roots of the story reach back decades, when the Ottoman Empire first set foot on European soil. In 1354, when the Turks crossed the Dardanelles and captured the fortress of Gallipoli, the process began that eventually led to the complete subjugation of the Balkans. Sultan Murad I, who came to power in 1362, was a brilliant military commander and organizer who understood that it wasn't enough merely to win on the battlefield, but permanent conquest had to be achieved. He gradually extended his rule over the Balkans, captured Edirne between 1361 and 1362, and made it his new capital, signaling that the Ottomans were staying in Europe. The Christian world, which had previously been united in the fight against infidels, was now fragmented and weak. Byzantium, which once ruled the eastern Mediterranean as a mighty empire, was now little more than a city-state trapped within the walls of Constantinople. The Christian kingdoms of the Balkans, Serbia, Bulgaria, Bosnia, rivaled each other instead of uniting against the common danger. And when Sultan Murad I defeated the Serbian army in the Battle of Kosovo on June 15, 1389, on St. Vitus's Day, it became clear that Christian resistance in the Balkans was collapsing. In the Battle of Kosovo, Murad I lost his life. A Serbian knight assassinated him immediately after the victory, but his son Bayezid I took power and proved to be an even more dangerous enemy. Bayezid, whom later contemporaries gave the nickname Lightning because he acted so quickly and appeared on the battlefield so suddenly, ruled with a combination of extraordinary energy and cruelty. Between 1390 and 1396, he practically conquered the entire Balkans. Bulgaria fell, Serbia became a vassal state, and even Byzantium was forced to pay annual tribute to avoid complete destruction. Around 1395, the situation became critical. Sultan Bayezid had been besieging Constantinople intermittently since 1394. The Byzantine Emperor, Manuel II, sent desperate messages to Western Europe asking for help. And now, finally, decades after the beginning of the Ottoman threat, the Western Christian rulers began to seriously deal with the problem. Hungary's situation was particularly delicate. Sigismund of Luxembourg, who became King of Hungary in 1386, was acutely aware of the Turkish threat. The southern borders of the Hungarian kingdom had been under constant threat for decades, and Sigismund knew that if the Balkans fell completely, Hungary would be next. But Sigismund was not in a position to face the Ottomans alone. He also struggled with internal opponents. Part of the Hungarian nobility was explicitly hostile toward him, and financial problems plagued the country. That's why Sigismund turned west for help. In 1395, he sent envoys to the French court, to Burgundy, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, urging Christian rulers to organize a crusade against the Turks. The message was simple: if they don't act now, all of Christian Europe is in danger. The response was surprisingly enthusiastic. In Western Europe, knightly culture was still in full bloom. Young Frenchmen and Burgundians had romantic ideas about the crusades their ancestors waged in the Holy Land. Knightly tournaments, heroic stories, and the desire for glory all suggested that an expedition against the Turks was not only a religious duty, but also a great adventure and an opportunity to gain fame. The Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Bold, particularly enthusiastically supported the plan. Philip, who was one of the richest and most powerful rulers of his time, saw this expedition as an opportunity to demonstrate Burgundy's power and his own glory. His eldest son, John, Count of Nevers, became the leader of the Burgundian contingent. John was a young, ambitious, and glory-hungry knight who could hardly wait to prove himself on the battlefield. Knights also came from the French court. French King Charles VI, who could not personally participate due to mental illness, gave his blessing to the expedition, and many French nobles joined. Among them were Count Henri de Bar, Marshal Guy de la Trémoille, Admiral Jean de Vienne, and Count Philippe d'Artois. These were all experienced, older knights who had already participated in numerous battles. Knights also came from English, German, and Spanish territories, though in smaller numbers. In total, the Western contingent numbered approximately 2,000 to 3,000 men, almost all heavily armored knights. This didn't seem like a huge army in itself, but the quality was outstanding. These were Europe's best-trained, best-equipped warriors. The Western Knights began gathering in Burgundy in the spring of 1395. Preparations lasted for months. Each knight brought his complete armor, weapons, horses, and personal retinue. The wealthier knights brought separate tents, food supplies, and even entertainers. The whole undertaking had a festive, almost carnival atmosphere. In the summer of 1395, the army departed from Burgundy. The route led down the Rhine, then down the Danube toward Hungary. The journey lasted months, and the first disagreements emerged even then. The young French and Burgundian knights, who had never fought in a real war, spoke contemptuously of Eastern Europeans, whom they considered barbaric and primitive. Their arrogant behavior already irritated the local population along the way. In the fall of 1395, the Western army arrived in Buda, where King Sigismund was waiting for them. The meeting was tense. Sigismund, who had faced the Turkish threat for decades and knew the peculiarities of Ottoman warfare, warned the Westerners to be cautious. He explained to them that Sultan Bayezid was not an ordinary enemy, but a brilliant strategist whose army was disciplined, well-organized, and much larger than anything they had seen in Western Europe. But young John of Nevers and his companions barely listened to him. They thought that the charge of heavily armored knights would steamroll anything, and that the Asian barbarians would not be able to resist them. According to contemporary chronicles, the Western knights boasted that their armor and courage would be enough for victory, and that it wasn't necessary to listen to those who knew the enemy. Sigismund knew this was dangerous arrogance, but politically he couldn't afford to offend his Western allies. He needed them not only militarily but also financially. So he didn't object too strongly, and hoped that experience would teach them reality. The specific plan for the campaign was developed in the spring of 1396. The goal was to march down the Danube, liberate Christian castles, and finally reach Constantinople, where they would relieve the Byzantine capital from siege. Sigismund's army, Hungarians, Croats, South Germans, Czechs, Poles, and Romanians, numbered approximately 10,000 to 15,000 men. To this were added the Western Knights, so the total strength could have been 16,000 to 20,000 men. In the summer of 1396, the Crusader army departed from Buda, heading south. The journey initially went smoothly. They defeated smaller Turkish garrisons and recaptured several castles. The Western Knights increasingly believed that victory was guaranteed. Morale was high, and the army marched forward with songs and banners. In August of 1396, the Crusader army reached the city of Nicopolis, which lay on the banks of the Danube in a strategically important location. Nicopolis was then in Turkish hands, and the garrison immediately locked itself behind the castle walls. The Crusaders laid siege to it, but it soon became clear that this would be time-consuming. The castle walls were strong, and the siege engines worked slowly. Meanwhile, Sultan Bayezid, who was working on the siege of Constantinople, heard news of the crusade. At first, he didn't take the threat seriously. He was used to Christians occasionally pulling themselves together, but then falling apart. But when his spies reported that the army was indeed significant and had already reached Nicopolis, the Sultan acted quickly. If you liked how this epic story unfolds, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. We have many more exciting medieval battles and dramatic historical moments ahead of us, and you shouldn't miss a single one. Bayezid well deserved the nickname Lightning. In just a few days, he abandoned the siege, gathered his army, and galloped north. By the end of August, the Turkish army, which according to most estimates numbered 35 to 40,000 men, reached the vicinity of Nicopolis. The Crusaders learned of the approaching danger late. When King Sigismund learned that Bayezid was already close, he convened a war council. At the meeting, two strategies basically emerged. Sigismund suggested that they wait under the walls of Nicopolis, fortify their position, and let the Turks attack. This way, the Crusaders would be in a defensive position and could take advantage of the terrain. Sigismund also suggested that the Hungarian and Eastern European troops, who knew the Turkish way of fighting, should be in the front line. But the Burgundian and French knights categorically rejected this. According to contemporary chronicles, John of Nevers and his companions, invoking knightly honor, demanded that they lead the attack and refused to stand in the second line. The dispute was sharp. The experienced Admiral Jean de Vienne tried to restrain the young knights, warning of recklessness, but the young men didn't listen to him. Knightly honor and the desire for glory was stronger than reason. Eventually, Sigismund was forced to give in. He knew that if he insisted too strongly on his own plan, it would only deepen the rift between the Westerners and the Hungarians, which would weaken the army's morale. So he agreed that the Western Knights would lead the first charge. At dawn on September 25th, both armies lined up. The battlefield was a gently sloping plain that stretched south of Nicopolis Castle. The arrangement of the Crusader army was as follows. In the first line, the Burgundian and French heavy cavalry, behind them Sigismund's Hungarian army and the other Eastern European contingents, on the flanks light cavalry and archers. The arrangement of the Turkish army was more complex. Bayezid applied a cunning strategy. In the first line, he placed the Anatolian auxiliary troops and the vassal Serbian, Bosnian, and Bulgarian units. These were not elite troops, but they were strong enough to absorb the Crusader charge. In the second line stood the Anatolian heavy cavalry and Turkish archers, and at the very back, as a reserve, he hid his real trump card, the Janissary infantry and the elite Sipahi cavalry. Around 8 o'clock in the morning, the Crusader knights began to prepare for the charge. The Burgundian knights in full armor, sitting on heavy war horses, formed the tip of the assault. John of Nevers, the Count of Coucy, Philippe d'Artois, and the other noble knights led at the front. The tension was palpable. The knights received blessings from priests in the camp and swore to return either with victory or death. The trumpet sounded the attack signal, and the knights set off. The heavily armored knights, more than 1,000 warriors, hurled themselves at full gallop toward the Turkish first line. The earth literally shook from the thunder of the hooves of armored horses. The Western knights charged shouting, with banners in their hands, fully convinced they would sweep away the enemy. And in the first moments, it seemed they were right. The Turkish first line, which consisted of Anatolian auxiliary troops and vassal Balkan units, couldn't resist the charge of heavy cavalry. The knights simply broke through them, smashing the ranks and massacring the enemy. The Crusader knights, who had never experienced victory so closely, broke forward in euphoria. But this was exactly what Sultan Bayezid was waiting for. The experienced Turkish soldiers knew that the strength of Western knights was in the charge, but when it lost momentum, they became vulnerable. The Sultan let the knights tire themselves out in slaughtering the first line, and then came the second blow. When the Burgundian knights, already partly exhausted and scattered, pushed forward, they suddenly faced the Turkish second line. Here stood the Anatolian archers, who shot from well-protected positions. The hissing of bows filled the air, and the sky darkened from the cloud of arrows that began to rain down on the knights. The armor of the Crusader knights provided protection, but the horses were vulnerable. Dozens of horses collapsed, struck by arrows, and the knights who fell to the ground could no longer fight. The heavy armor, which had been an advantage during the charge, now became a hindrance. Knights lying on the ground couldn't stand up and became easy prey for the Turkish light cavalry. But the Burgundian knights still didn't give up. John of Nevers, although he saw that his men were suffering more and more casualties, continued to lead them forward because he knew that if they turned back, it would be complete panic. The knights desperately tried to break through the Turkish archer line, but the Turks retreated in a disciplined manner, setting more and more traps. And then came the fatal moment. Sultan Bayezid deployed his reserves. The Janissaries, the elite infantry unit of the Ottoman Empire, trained from slaves and Christian boys, stepped forward. These soldiers were fanatically loyal to the Sultan, perfectly disciplined, and fought to the death. Armed with long spears and swords, they stood like a wall before the Burgundian knights. The Janissary line didn't break. The Crusader knights, who were already exhausted from the long charge, couldn't break through this living wall. The Janissaries' spears simply stabbed into the horses and among the knights who couldn't advance. The Burgundian charge lost its momentum. Behind them, at the Hungarian army, King Sigismund watched in horror as the Burgundian knights got stuck. He knew he had to intervene now, before complete catastrophe developed, but he still waited, hoping that the Burgundians would somehow break through after all. They didn't break through. Instead, what Sigismund had always feared now happened. Bayezid deployed the elite Sipahi cavalry. These heavily armed Turkish knights, who were no less fearsome than Western knights, now launched a flank attack on the Burgundian knights. The Sipahis, who attacked fresh and at full strength, shattered the exhausted, scattered Burgundian knights. The Burgundian charge, which had begun with glory, now turned into catastrophe. The knights, who had previously broken forward victoriously, were now forced to retreat. But the retreat, especially in heavy armor, exhausted, proved to be almost impossible. The Turkish cavalry surrounded them, and the massacre began. Around John of Neves and a few principal knights, desperate fighting continued for a while. The Burgundian duke, though young and inexperienced, fought bravely. His bodyguards protected him, and for a while it seemed that perhaps they could escape. But eventually the superior force was overwhelming. John's horse was shot out from under him, and he himself was taken prisoner. King Sigismund now knew that if he didn't act immediately, the entire army was lost. The Hungarian and Eastern European troops were still intact, and Sigismund gave the order to advance. The Hungarian heavy cavalry, the Croatian and Czech contingent, and the armies of the Romanian boyars now entered the battle. The Hungarians, who were experienced veterans in fights against the Turks, didn't rush blindly at the enemy. They advanced in disciplined formation and cautiously tried to exploit the chaos caused by the Burgundian knights. For a while it seemed that perhaps the outcome of the battle could be reversed. But Bayezid didn't let himself be surprised. The Sultan, who commanded from the background of the battle, immediately assessed the situation. His reserves were still strong, and he received the Hungarian attack coldly. The light cavalry of the Turkish army quickly outflanked the Hungarians and launched flank attacks. The battle now descended into complete chaos. The remnants of the Burgundian knights were still fighting in various places. The Hungarians were trying to advance, and the Turkish army, which had numerical superiority, gradually surrounded the entire Crusader army. By afternoon, the situation had become hopeless. King Sigismund, who saw that the battle was lost, faced a difficult decision. Either stay and fight to the last man, or try to escape so he could later rebuild the army. His advisors begged him to flee, because if he too was captured or killed, Hungary would be defenseless. Sigismund eventually chose the second option. The Hungarian king, with his entourage, cut his way through the encirclement and galloped toward the Danube. Ships waiting on the river saved him and several thousand soldiers who escaped from the battlefield. But most of the army, the Burgundian knights, the French knights, the Czech and Croatian units, all remained trapped. The end of the battle was terrible. The Turkish soldiers, who already sensed victory, mercilessly cut down the Crusader soldiers. Thousands perished in the massacre. Those who were considered noble prisoners, like John of Nevers, Philippe d'Artois, and other Western knights, surrendered, hoping they would be released in exchange for ransom. But the next morning came the most horrific event. Sultan Bayezid, who had deliberated all night in his camp, decided that an example had to be made. He gave the order that all Crusader prisoners, except the most valuable nobles, for whom he hoped for enormous ransom, should be executed. The Ottoman soldiers lined up the Crusader prisoners and beheaded them one by one. Contemporary sources often exaggerate numbers, but modern historians estimate that approximately 2,000 to 3,000 men were slaughtered on that day and in the following days. John of Nevers and the other noble prisoners spent months in Turkish captivity. Eventually, a huge ransom was paid for them, 200,000 gold coins for John of Nevers, which was an enormous sum, and in 1397 they were released. But when they returned to France, they were no longer the same people. The young, glory-hungry knights had become broken, traumatized veterans who never again spoke willingly about Nicopolis. Count Philippe d'Artois didn't return home. He fell in battle, and his death further grieved French knighthood. Admiral Jean de Vienne also fell at Nicopolis, and his death was a great loss because he was one of the most experienced military commanders who had warned his companions in advance of the dangers of recklessness. King Sigismund, who escaped, never got over the defeat. The catastrophe of the Nicopolis battle weakened his position in Hungary, and it took years before he rebuilt the army. But the Turkish threat never ceased after that. After Nicopolis, Sultan Bayezid continued his conquests, and only the unexpected attack of the Mongols, Tamerlane's army, which defeated Bayezid in the Battle of Ankara on July 20, 1402, saved Europe from complete Ottoman conquest. King Sigismund still ruled for a long time. In 1413, he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor, thus finally achieving the highest title of the empire. But the fight against the Turks continued. In 1428 at Golombok, he suffered another defeat by the Turks, which showed that the Ottoman threat had not disappeared. Sigismund died in 1437, and although he did much to strengthen Hungary and the empire, the memory of Nicopolis questioned his reputation throughout. The fate of John of Nevers was perhaps the most symbolic. The young duke who set out on the expedition with full enthusiasm, dreaming of glory and heroism, returned home completely broken. During the months of captivity, he saw how the Ottomans treated prisoners, saw the executions of his companions, and understood how naive and dangerous his romantic idea of war had been. In 1404, when his father Philip the Bold died, John became Duke of Burgundy, but he never again launched another military adventure. Instead, he devoted himself to the arts, diplomacy, and the internal strengthening of Burgundy. Until his death in 1439, he rarely spoke of Nicopolis, and if he did, it was always in a tone of deep sorrow. The memory of the Battle of Nicopolis burned deeply into Europe's collective consciousness. It was the last great medieval crusade, and the complete failure showed that the old knightly world order no longer worked in the face of new challenges. The charge of heavy armored cavalry, which had been a decisive weapon for centuries, was now no longer enough against the disciplined, well-organized Ottoman army. Contemporary chroniclers, although they often exaggerated or dramatized, all agreed that Nicopolis was a turning point. The chronicles emphasized that it wasn't a lack of courage that lost the battle, but pride and ignorance. The Western knights were unwilling to listen to those who knew the enemy and thought that their names and armor would be enough for victory. But the Turks didn't know these names and didn't care about the armor. They only wanted victory, and they achieved it. The lesson of the Nicopolis defeat was more than the loss of one battle. It was one of the first clear signs of the end of the Middle Ages, when old values, knightly honor, feudal hierarchy, the crusading ideal, collided with the realities of the New World. The Ottoman army, which consisted of professional, well-paid, disciplined soldiers, represented the beginning of modern warfare, while the Crusader knights still lived in a romantic past. The consequences of the Battle of Nicopolis were far-reaching. In Western Europe, they mourned the fallen knights for decades, and the defeat deeply shook the self-confidence of the Christian world. It was proven that the Ottoman threat was real and deadly, and that Christian Europe couldn't unite against it. For Hungary, Nicopolis was the beginning of a century-long struggle. The Turkish threat, which after 1396 directly threatened the Hungarian borders, gradually approached. János Hunyadi, the great Hungarian military commander in the middle of the 15th century, won several victories against the Turks, but the pressure remained constant. On November 10, 1444, in the Battle of Varna, another Crusader army suffered a catastrophic defeat, this time the army of the Polish-Hungarian Union, in which the young King Władysław I also lost his life. The final blow came on August 29, 1526, when in the Battle of Mohacs, the army of King Louis II suffered a catastrophic defeat from the army of Sultan Suleiman I. The Hungarian king himself also fell, and much of Hungary came under Turkish rule. This process, which began at Nicopolis, was thus fulfilled 130 years later. But the memory of the Battle of Nicopolis lived on not only in political and military consequences. For contemporaries, it was the last moment when medieval knighthood tried once more to prove its greatness, and tragically failed. The world that existed before Nicopolis, where knights were the masters of war, where the crusading ideal still lived vibrantly, where the feudal order still seemed solid, never returned. The stories of the survivors haunted Europe for decades. Those knights, who were eventually released in exchange for ransom, were changed people upon returning home. The months of captivity, the sight of companions' executions, and the trauma of complete defeat left deep marks on them. At the French court, the Nicopolis catastrophe left a deep imprint. King Charles VI, who by then was suffering from serious mental illness, was unable to comprehend the events, but the other members of the court mourned sincerely. The cream of French knighthood was lost at Nicopolis, and the dreams of an entire generation collapsed. At the Burgundian court, they mourned the fallen for many years. Philip the Bold, who had been the greatest supporter of the expedition, deeply regretted his decision. According to contemporary accounts, the Duke publicly expressed his pain over exposing his son to such danger. But perhaps the Nicopolis defeat had the deepest impact on common people. Throughout Europe, in villages and towns, they mourned those who left and never returned. Not just the knights, but the sergeants, squires, servants, thousands who accompanied their lords and whose names weren't preserved in history, but who died just the same on that bloody field. The Church also tried to interpret the catastrophe. Some preachers proclaimed that God had punished Christians for their sins, especially for pride and recklessness. Others claimed it was a test that was preparing the Christian world for an even greater struggle. But for most simple believers, Nicopolis simply meant that the Turks were stronger and that Christian Europe was in danger. The impact of the Battle of Nicopolis on military thinking was also significant. After the defeat, Western European armies began to reconsider their strategy. They realized that the medieval knightly charge by itself wasn't enough, that without discipline and coordination, even the best equipment was worthless, and that they must not underestimate the enemy, especially if they were as experienced and organized as the Ottoman army. New military studies and analyses slowly began to appear, examining the Nicopolis mistakes. The lesson was clear. War is not a knightly tournament where they fight according to rules. War is such that the wisest, most disciplined, and best prepared wins. In the 15th century, as the Ottoman threat drew ever closer to Central Europe, the memory of Nicopolis served as a warning. János Hunyadi, the great Hungarian military commander who successfully fought against the Turks for decades, often recalled Nicopolis as an example of what not to do. Hunyadi knew that only discipline, strategy, and realistic self-knowledge could lead to victory against the Ottomans. And although he himself also suffered defeats, his military legacy was much more positive than that of those who commanded at Nicopolis. The irony of history is that the city of Nicopolis was later besieged several times by various armies. The castle, which in 1396 was in Turkish hands, and during whose siege Bayezid was reached by news of the Crusader army, remained an important strategic point for centuries. And the site of the defeat, that open plain south of the city where blood once stained the ground red, gradually returned to its natural state. But the local inhabitants for generations told stories about the great battle when Christians and Turks clashed. Over time, as the Middle Ages ended and the modern era began, The memory of Nicopolis gradually faded in general awareness. For new generations, it was just a story from the past, one of many failed enterprises. But for those who knew history, Nicopolis always had special significance. It was the moment when it became clear that medieval Europe was no longer capable of stopping the new, emerging forces. It was the day when the illusions of the knightly world shattered against hard reality. Modern historians still debate the precise details of the Battle of Nicopolis. The numbers, exact tactical maneuvers, and the sequence of certain events all are subjects of debate. But what is indisputable is the significance of the battle. Nicopolis wasn't simply a lost battle, it was the end of an era, the collapse of a world order, and the beginning of a new, much more dangerous age. The Ottoman Empire, which after Nicopolis seemed unstoppable, continued its expansion. Although Sultan Bayezid was defeated and captured by Tamerlane in 1402, which gave Europe a few decades of breathing space, the Ottomans quickly rebuilt their empire. Sultan Mehmed II regained power and after 1421 unified the empire. On May 29, 1453, he finally captured Constantinople, thereby definitively closing the thousand-year history of the Byzantine Empire. From the perspective of Hungarian history, Nicopolis was the beginning of that tragic path that led to the field of Mohacs. In 1526, 130 years after Nicopolis, the Hungarian army suffered another catastrophic defeat from the Turks, and again the same mistakes were repeated: excessive self-confidence, division, and underestimation of the enemy. But perhaps the deepest lesson of the Battle of Nicopolis is still human, not military. The story in which young, enthusiastic knights weave dreams of glory and then face the brutal reality of war is eternally valid. In every age, in every culture, there are moments when romantic ideas collide with reality, when heroic rhetoric meets the bloody chaos of the battlefield. The knights who fell and were captured at the Battle of Nicopolis didn't become tragic figures because they were cowardly or weak. On the contrary, they were brave, even reckless. Their tragedy lay in the fact that wisdom didn't accompany their courage, that realism wasn't beside their enthusiasm, and that their desire for glory suppressed caution. A 16th-century Hungarian chronicler summarized the events thus: "At Nicopolis, it wasn't ungodliness that triumphed over piety, but wisdom triumphed over recklessness, discipline over chaos, and reality over illusions." Today, more than 628 years later, when there's long been no age of knighthood, when medieval warfare is a museum relic, and when the Ottoman Empire too has become part of history, the memory of Nicopolis still speaks to us. It reminds us that history isn't a romantic adventure, but hard, cruel reality. That courage alone is never enough if there isn't prudence with it, and that the greatest tragedies often don't arise from the victory of evil, but from the failure of good intentions. On the Nicopolis plain, where Turkish arrows once rained down and where the blood of Crusader knights watered the earth, today peaceful fields stretch out. Tourists who visit there can hardly imagine that one of Europe's greatest and bloodiest battles once took place here. The castle, which stands on the bank of the Danube, still preserves the memory of that day when the Middle Ages clashed with the emerging New Age and suffered defeat. But the real monument isn't in stones, but in the stories we pass down from generation to generation. Every time we tell the story of Nicopolis, we bring to life again those knights who went there for glory and found death. We hear again the enthusiastic commands of John of Nevers before the charge. We see again King Sigismund's calm but worried gaze as he watches the reckless charge of the Burgundian knights. And we feel again that sadness and lesson that this tragic day left us. If this dramatic and tragic story amazed you, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share the video with those interested in the Middle Ages, Hungarian history, and great historical turning points. In the comments, I'm waiting to hear which moment touched you most in this story. In our upcoming videos, we'll explore together more exciting medieval battles and events. Stay with us and follow us on this journey to history's most defining moments. Don't let the magic of the Middle Ages pass you by. Discover with us those days when the direction of history changed with a single battle. September 25th, 1396. A date that forever reminds us that history isn't kind to those who don't learn from it, and that even the greatest courage cannot substitute for the lack of wisdom. It was the day when medieval knighthood stood forth one last time in full splendor and suffered defeat. It was the day when a dream ended and a long struggle began in the shadow of the Ottoman threat. And perhaps this is the most important message of the Battle of Nicopolis for us, people of the 21st century as well. That the past isn't just a story to be told, but a teacher. That the mistakes our ancestors made can serve as lessons even today. And that human nature, the mixture of courage and pride, hope and recklessness, is the same today as it was more than 600 years ago on that fateful September day at Nicopolis.